The wind came first. Not the cold. That came second, creeping like a hand through every crack in the squared log wall. But the sound of it, a howl that had traveled 200 miles off the Saskatchewan plains and did not stop, not even for a breath. Iola Renville stood at the base of her cast-iron stove on the morning of January 14th, 1881, feeding it a length of split oak from the wood box beside her hip, and the wind outside rattled the leather hinges of the door frame as if some enormous animal were testing every seam of her cabin. She was 28 years old. She wore her wool skirt and a cotton shift, and her mother's blanket around her shoulders, and the thermometer nailed to the inside of her eastern window read 54 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. 3 miles south and downslope, at the Cannonball Trading Post, the Mandan thermometer was recording 50 degrees below zero. The polar dome, that high-pressure ridge of Arctic air that had slipped south from the pole itself, would stay for 72 hours. 60-mile-per-hour wind would scour the Dakota Territory without mercy. By the time it lifted on the morning of January 15th, a line of iron stove cabins would have cooled to 4 degrees inside, their cast-iron stoves popping at the seams from the shock of thermal stress, their water buckets frozen solid, their chimneys rimmed with frost that had formed from the moisture of the last held breaths of their inhabitants. On the South Road, the Tiona family in their bare log cabin, no robes, no insulation, just log and winter, would lose one of their own in the dark, the person not waking when the other moved the wood stove embers in desperation, finding the form too cold to warm. But in Iola Renville's squared log cabin, 3 miles north on the bench above the Cannonball River where it meets the Missouri, the air remained at 54 degrees, and the girl of 10 who slept in the back corner, wrapped in 3 of the 8 buffalo robes that hung floor to ceiling on the interior walls, would wake when the morning light came gray through the eastern window and would be warm. Behind her in the darkness, her niece Wíyaka, the name meant feather in the old Lakota tongue, drew the robes closer around her shoulders without waking, and the fur on the inside of each robe facing the cabin air did not frost. The 8 buffalo robes had not always hung on her walls. Iola had learned the method from her grandmother, a Sisseton Lakota woman named Winona, who had lived the 60 winters before the Dakota War, who had taught her own daughters and grandchildren how the Thathanka, the buffalo, had kept the plains warm for 10,000 winters, with nothing but hide and hair and the space between their own selves and the earth. Her grandmother had shown her the construction, how the dense underfur created a wool-like matrix that refused to let heat escape, how the hollow guard hairs, each one a tiny air-filled tube extending 6 to 8 centimeters from the hide, created chambers where still air could be trapped, how the layering of these hairs meant that even a fierce wind could not penetrate to the skin beneath. She had watched her grandmother's hands arrange robes in the old lodges, the fur side always facing inward, toward the warmth, and she had understood without words why this was so. After the war in 1862, after her family had walked away from Parle Mission in Minnesota with nothing but what they could carry on their backs, after they had been settled at Fort Yates by the Indian agents, and her mother Mary had begun to make a new life in a wooden frame house on the military reserve, Iola had listened to her grandmother speak of the old insulation, the old warmth, the old knowledge. When she married Daniel Tiona in 1869, a gentle Métis freight wagon driver whose family had come from the Saskatchewan fur posts and whose hands knew how to build and repair and make things last, He had agreed to build her a cabin in the way she understood, with squared logs laid in the old Métis style, with oak joints at the corners, with a flat roof that could hold snow. They had selected the logs carefully, cutting only straight white pine with tight grain, sapwood removed. They built it in 1875, just before the winters began to turn lean and cruel. The first winter had been manageable, and Daniel had built a stove box from fieldstone and clay, setting the cast iron stove into it to radiate heat more evenly. The second winter had nearly frozen them both. In the autumn of 1877, Daniel had gone out on a freight crossing of the Missouri River in January. A terrible time to move goods, but the trader's orders had been urgent, and the commission would have been substantial, and he had not returned. The ice had taken him. The Missouri had taken him in the dark. He went silent on that ice, vanishing into a darkness that no amount of calling or searching could retrieve. And in the spring, they found his wagon 6 miles downstream. But they never found him. Iola was now a widow at 26, with a cabin that felt immense and empty, with a wood stove that seemed to draw heat from the very air itself rather than provide it. Her brother and his wife, who had taken the same route, the same night, attempting the same desperate winter crossing, did not return either. They had 3 young ones. None of them survived the first week of January, cold in the relative's cabin at Fort Yates. The settlement brought her their sole surviving daughter, Wíyaka, then 6 years old, orphaned by the cold and by an ice crossing that had claimed her mother and father and 2 siblings in a single night. Iola had looked at this small girl with eyes too old for her face, and she had thought of what the Métis traders said in the fort. Next winter, she would die. She would freeze. The cold would take her, as it had taken the others. The girl's dreams were filled with the sound of ice breaking, so in the autumn of 1878, after a December cold snap that pushed the cabin down to 41 degrees inside, cold enough that the morning water bucket had an ice skin thick enough to stand a finger in, Iola had traded her labor, work that would have earned her $4.25 in hard currency, work cutting and preparing hides at Fort Yates for the trading company, and a copper penny in favor to her cousin, Joseph Renville, for 4 prime winter pelt buffalo robes from his autumn hunt. The trade had been made fairly. Joseph knew what the robes were worth, and he knew what Iola was trying to do, and he gave them to her with a nod that held no pity, only recognition. The robes had been taken between November and February, when the Thathanka were at their fullest, when the underfur beneath the guard hairs had reached its peak density, 4 to 5 centimeters of dense, wool-like fiber that held warmth through the cruelest plains winters. She had carried them home over her shoulders, the weight of them pressing her down to the earth. She had hired a man from the settlement, Pierre Moreau, to help her drive 4 oak pegs into the uppermost log courses of her east and north walls. She had asked a carpenter from Mandan, Sverre Johansson, who understood wood, to split cedar saplings into thin spacer strips, which cost her 1 keg of steel nails. These strips, 1/2 inch thick, were nailed to the back of each robe at regular intervals, creating a gap of exactly 1 inch between the squared logs and the robes themselves. She had hung the robes with the fur side facing inward, toward the cabin air, so that the soft underfur could trap the heat that radiated from the wood stove. The guard hairs, the long hollow ones extending 6 to 8 centimeters from the hide, faced outward, their air-filled chambers creating a layered barrier. The engineering was simple and old. The buffalo hide itself provided roughly 12 units of insulation, what builders would call R12. The 1-inch still air gap created by the cedar strips provided another unit, R1, because trapped air cannot move and becomes an insulator. The squared log wall itself, being substantial white pine and well chinked, provided approximately 10 units, R10. Together, the assembly created approximately 23 units of insulation resistance, R23. A bare log wall offered only 10. This meant the robes, combined with the air gap and the logs, made the wall more than twice as warm as it would have been without them. The cost had been 1 keg of nails and 20 pounds of cornmeal, a total trade value of roughly $32, or about $15 cheaper than buying sawn boards at the Fort Yates mill. That first winter, with only 4 robes, the cabin had held at 48 degrees in the coldest part of January, and Wíyaka had not woken screaming from nightmares of cold. In the autumn of 1879, after Joseph returned from another hunt with 8 prime robes from his successful expedition, Iola had traded for 4 more robes. The full complement now, 8 robes hanging floor to ceiling along the eastern and northern walls where the wind came fiercest and the cold pressed hardest against the cabin. The following winter had been mild by the territory standards, but the thermometer had never dropped below 41 degrees inside, and Wíyaka had not woken in the dark with the sound of ice forming in the bucket beside her bed, had not woken trembling with memories of her parents last night. The method was Lakota. The method was Métis. The method was old, older than any written record, older than Boston seminaries and Methodist theology, and Iola had never doubted it for a single moment through all the years of Reverend Pickering's disapproval and the settlement's uncertain silence. The Reverend Samuel Pickering had arrived at Cannonball Settlement in the spring of 1880, carried north by a Methodist mission circuit from a Boston seminary, and he had brought with him the bright certainty of a man who believed that the frontier was barbarism and that his task was to civilize it. He was 41 years old, soft-handed, never having cut wood or driven a peg or hauled water from a frozen river. He had a sawn board interior in the parsonage, real boards from the Mandan mill, not split shakes, and glass windows that let in light, but also let out heat with terrible efficiency. He preached in autumn 1880 a sermon series called Leaving the Buffalo Path Behind, in which he explained to the assembled women of the settlement that to advance toward Christian civilization, they must abandon the old ways, the Indian ways, the ways of the buffalo and the hide, and the backward thinking that had kept them poor. The proper Christian homestead, he said, had planed boards inside, a parlor stove with a chimney that drew without leaking, and a woman who knew how to read and write English and did not speak in the old tongues. In October 1880, he came to the Cannonball trading post, where Iola had gone to trade some smoked fish for salt and flour, and he took her aside with a gentle hand on her elbow and told her, in front of the postmaster and 2 other women, that her robes were holding the settlement back, that the young women of the community looked at her walls and thought they did not need to learn better, that he would lend her $3.25 from the church fund, a gift, really, a gesture of Christian kindness, to purchase sawn boards from the Mandan mill, if only she would agree to remove the robes and board up her walls properly. Iola had looked at him with the courtesy that her mother Mary had taught her, and she had thanked him for his kindness, and she had declined. She had spoken in English, and clearly, and without anger. She said that the robes were adequate to her needs, that she did not require boards, and that she intended to keep the walls as they were. The Reverend had smiled as though she were a small girl who did not understand, and he had pressed the coins into her hand anyway, and when she would not take them, he had left them on the counter of the trading post. The postmaster, a half-breed Métis named Armand Thibault, had looked at Iola and then at the coins, and he had said nothing. The council of the settlement, 11 men, 3 of them Norwegian, 4 of them Métis, 4 of them Anglo, had met the following week, and they had voted to ask the Reverend to be patient with the widow Renville, that her ways were old, but she meant well, and that no harm was coming from her. The vote was 6-5. The Reverend had smiled and said he would pray for them. The winter of 1880 and 1881 had come on early. By the first week of December, the thermometer at the trading post was reading 30 degrees below zero at sunset, and people had begun to speak in low voices about the feel in the air, the way the north wind carried something ancient and terrible in it. On the 10th of December, the Mandan thermometer showed 42 below at noon. The cattle in the corrals stopped moving much, just stood with their heads down, and the youngsters in the schoolhouse stopped playing at recess and huddled by the single stove. By the 27th of December, it had touched 50 below, and then, mercifully, a mild spell had come in on a southern wind, and for 3 days the temperature had climbed back to 20 below, and people had begun to relax, to believe that the worst was past. The Reverend Pickering, in his preaching on the last Sunday of 1880, had spoken of the Lord's mercy and the blessing of survival, and he had looked directly at Iola, where she sat with Wíyaka in the back of the mission room, and she had understood that he believed his prayers had brought the mild spell, that the buffalo robes would now prove unnecessary, that civilization and Christian faith had been vindicated. She said nothing. She sat with her niece, and she listened, and her fingers worked the rattle that her grandmother had given her, a small dried gourd on a sinew cord that made a soft sound like a breath. The mild spell lasted through the 2nd and 3rd of January. It was a false reprieve. On the 11th of January, 1881, at 3 in the morning, the wind changed. It came from the north and west, screaming down from the Arctic with a sound that woke everyone in their beds and set the horses running in panicked circles in the corrals. The temperature at the Mandan thermometer began to fall, 10 degrees per hour at first, then 5 degrees every 30 minutes as the night deepened. By dawn on the 11th, it stood at 38 below. By noon, it had reached 50 below and was still falling. The cabin windows, those with glass that the Reverend had been so proud of, began to frost inside as the temperature differential between the interior and exterior grew so extreme that the condensation could not evaporate. By noon, they had turned opaque white. On the South Road, in the cabin of the family named Tiona, no relation to Daniel, but kinfolk nonetheless, another Métis family from the Saskatchewan who had arrived in 1876 with high hopes and good tools. The cast-iron stove was running so hot that a person had to stand more than 6 feet away from it not to feel the skin burning. Yet the cabin interior, measured by the thermometer that hung on the western wall, read only 19 degrees at midday on the 13th. By evening, it had dropped to 12. By midnight of the 12th, it read 6 degrees. The Tiona cabin had no robes. The walls were bare squared logs, chinked with mud in the old way, with a double-thickness hide as a door, but no insulation, no air gap, no second layer between the inhabitants and the howling darkness outside. The walls radiated heat away at a terrifying rate, as if the cold outside was so demanding that it pulled the warmth right through the wood itself. The father in the Tiona cabin, a man named Henri, had kept the stove burning all night and all of the following day, through the whole of the 12th and into the 13th. His hands were blistered from carrying wood, the skin cracked and bleeding. His voice had gone hoarse from coughing in the smoke that the chimney could no longer draw properly. The Arctic air was so cold and dense that it would not rise, and the smoke backed up into the room, a white fog that burned the eyes and lungs. By the evening of the 13th of January, the Tiona cabin interior had fallen to 8 degrees, despite the stove burning at red heat. And by midnight, as the fuel finally ran out, it dropped to 6 degrees. On the morning of the 14th, one of the 2 parents in that cabin, it was Henry's wife, a woman named Rose, did not wake. The other parent lay beside them, unable to move, unable to call for help, frozen in place in the darkness. The polar dome that had settled over the Dakota Territory was what modern meteorologists would call a 100-year event, a configuration of high-pressure ridges that occurred only once in a century, if that. The Mandan thermometer on the morning of the 14th of January, 1881, read 50 degrees below zero. The wind off the Saskatchewan plains gusted at 60 miles per hour, with even stronger downdrafts where the air was forced through the valleys and coulees. The temperature drop rate was so severe that exposed skin would freeze in less than 5 minutes. A person could not breathe the air without the vapor in their lungs freezing and causing internal injury. The settlement had essentially ceased to exist as a functioning community. Families were isolated in their cabins, burning wood at terrifying rates, fighting the cold with the only tool they had, fire. Most of the cabins with cast iron stoves had interior temperatures that had fallen to 4 degrees by the evening of the 13th, and many were dropping further as the fuel ran out, and the people began to make impossible choices about whether to burn furniture, whether to burn the siding of their cabins, whether to burn the floor. In the parsonage, the Reverend Samuel Pickering sat at his desk on the morning of the 14th, with a blanket wrapped around himself and his books, and the thermometer on his wall read 8 degrees. His fine sawnboard interior, his glass windows, his planed board parlor walls, all of it had become a liability. The boards drew cold into the cabin more efficiently than the bare logs would have. The glass windows radiated heat away with horrifying speed. The parsonage, which he had been so proud of, was one of the coldest buildings in the settlement. He had no more than a day's worth of wood left. His hands had begun to shake in a way that was not entirely from the cold. Meanwhile, 3 miles north on the bench, where the Cannonball River met the Missouri, in a cabin with 8 buffalo robes hanging floor to ceiling on the interior walls, with a 1-inch cedar strip air gap between the robes and the logs, with the fur side of each robe facing inward into the cabin air. Still air trapped in the hollow guard hairs of the Tatanka, the hair that had kept the buffalo warm on the winter plains for longer than any record, longer than any living memory. The thermometer read 54 degrees. The fire in the wood stove burned at a steady, moderate rate. Wood would last for days still, maybe a week. The girl of 10 lay under 3 robes and slept through the howling wind without waking, and her small breath made no frost on the blanket that covered her face. At dawn on the 15th of January, when the wind had still not relented, and the Mandan thermometer read 38 degrees below zero, Reverend Samuel Pickering put on his heaviest coat, which was not heavy enough, a wool coat manufactured in Boston, not designed for the Dakota Territory extremes, and his wool hat, and he stepped out of the parsonage with his hat in his hand, a strange gesture but a sign of humility, a sign that he came not as a preacher bearing truth, but as a supplicant bearing nothing, asking without authority. And he began to walk north along the trail toward Iola Renville's cabin. 4 miles and 38 degrees below zero, with a wind at 40 miles per hour, was a calculation of survival, a mathematics that had very few positive outcomes. Every exposed inch of skin would freeze solid in 4 minutes. The fingers would lose sensation in 3. The muscles would begin to seize after 10. Frostbite would begin in the extremities almost immediately. Most of the time, a person who walked into that cold alone did not return. Most of the time, they were found in the spring, preserved in the snow, their faces frozen in expressions that varied from peaceful to anguished. But the Reverend had no choice. The parsonage was failing, not slowly, but with the accelerating certainty of a physical system reaching its limit. He had tried to burn the doors yesterday, the wooden doors that had cost good money to transport from the east, but there were only 2 more to burn before he had nothing left but the walls themselves. And walls took hours to burn completely if they caught at all. He had tried to burn sections of the floorboard, the sawn boards that he had been so proud of, but the risk of fire consuming everything was too great, and he had stopped and sat instead in the darkness, shaking, understanding the horrible mathematics of his situation. In the darkness of the pre-dawn, alone with his books and his theological certainty, he had realized that he was going to freeze. He was going to lie down in his cabin, and the cold would take him in his sleep, as it had taken Rose Tiona in her cabin on the South Road. He was going to become another name spoken in the spring, another loss, another tragedy attributed to the frontier's cruelty. He did not want to die. He did not want to be found in April, another Boston Seminary man who had not understood what survival required. So, he had thought of Iola Renville and her robes and the cabin that the settlement women said never got cold no matter how severe the winter. And he had understood, with a clarity that shame and theological training and intellectual pride could not obscure, that he had been catastrophically, fundamentally, and perhaps fatally wrong. He had been wrong about civilization and boards and glass windows. He had been wrong about the buffalo path and the old ways. He had been wrong about what it meant to be Christian in a place where the temperature dropped to 50 below. He had been wrong, and he was going to ask for forgiveness, and he was going to ask for help. And if she refused him, he would accept that as God's judgment, as justice even, for his arrogance. He walked 4 miles in the dark. His fingers went numb first, and then his face. And then the cold was so severe that it stopped hurting. The pain went away, and that was the most dangerous thing that could happen, because it meant the freezing was reaching the deeper tissues. He walked. He thought of nothing. He put one foot in front of the other. The wind tried to knock him down. Snow rose to his knees in the drifts. When he came to the bench above the Cannonball River and saw the cabin below him, the one with the cedar shake roof that had not collapsed from ice like 3 others had, with smoke rising from the chimney in a steady column, with no frost visible on the windows, even from a distance, when he saw that, he wept. He did not know if it was gratitude or shame or cold. The tears froze on his face as he walked. When he reached the door of the cabin, he was not sure his hand would work well enough to knock. He pushed the door open instead. It had swung inward at a touch, and he collapsed in the threshold, still holding his hat in one hand. Iola Renville had been awake since before dawn, tending the fire, making breakfast porridge from cornmeal and dried berries, listening to Wíyaka stir under the robes in the corner, She heard the wind, and she heard it change, a certain quality of sound that meant a person was moving against it, deliberately, struggling. She had heard that sound before, on the night Daniel had not returned. She knew what it meant. When the Reverend collapsed in her doorway, she saw the frost on his beard, the way his fingers were pale and waxy, the temperature in his eyes that meant the cold had reached into him deep. She did not speak. She picked him up. He was lighter than she expected, the cold taking weight as well as heat, and she brought him to the fire, and she wrapped him in a blanket. She put his hands in water that was warming on the stove, which was agony for him, which was necessary. When color began to return to his extremities, when his shaking had subsided to a level where he could hold a cup of hot broth, she sat across from him and waited for him to speak. What he said was simple. The parsonage was failing. 4 other cabins were failing. The families inside them would not last another night. He had come to ask her for help. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not ask her to acknowledge that he had been wrong. He simply asked, could she spare robes? Could she help? Iola looked at him for a long time. Then she stood and she walked to the corner where she kept her storage, and she climbed up into the rafters where she had stored 2 of her 8 robes. Extras, kept against the possibility that the winter would be even more severe than the 8 could manage. She pulled them down. They were heavy, weighing perhaps 30 pounds each, the underfur still dense with its small air chambers, the guard hairs still capable of doing what they had done on the backs of the buffalo for countless winters. She held them out to him. Then she dressed in her warmest coat, and she wrapped the 2 robes around her shoulders, and she walked with the Reverend back through the 38-degree cold toward the settlement. They did not speak. The Reverend walked with more strength than he had come with. The hour by the fire had given him a reprieve, but it would not last long. Iola kept pace with him, and when his steps began to slow, she touched his elbow and kept him moving. When they reached the parsonage, she helped him hang one of the robes on the interior eastern wall, using the pegs that were already there from some forgotten previous attempt at decoration. She showed him how the robe needed to hang, fur side facing in, creating a barrier between the cabin air and the brutal exterior cold. Within hours, the parsonage interior had risen to 42 degrees. By the evening of the 15th, it had climbed to 48. The Reverend had given the 2nd robe to the family 3 houses down the road, and Iola herself had carried the 3rd and 4th robes, taken now from her cabin, leaving her with only 4 robes to insulate her and Wíyaka, to the Tiona and Thibault cabins, which were the most desperate. By the 18th of January, when the polar dome finally lifted and the wind ceased, and the temperature began to climb back toward 20 below and then 10 below, every surviving family in the Cannonball settlement had warmth. The Reverend Pickering stood in the mission room on the first Sunday after the storm and spoke of God's mercy and the wisdom of the people who had been given to the care, and he did not speak of civilization or boards or the buffalo path. When Iola Renville walked in with Wíyaka, he looked at her directly, and he nodded, and she nodded in return. Nothing more was said, and nothing more needed to be. The settlement, without any formal acknowledgement or council vote, simply ceased entirely to call her ways backward. The robes remained on her walls through the following winter, and through the winter after that, and through 31 winters more, until the year 1912, when Iola was an old woman, and the robes finally wore thin enough that she took them down. By then, everyone in the territory knew what they had been. Not decoration, not primitive thinking, but engineering of the highest kind, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 winters, the knowledge that the cold could be survived, and that a woman who knew the old methods could save not only her own kin, but a whole community of strangers. The robes hung on those walls every season in the darkness of the winter months, quietly reminding anyone who was present of what it meant to be warm.